Well, welcome to another Friday night. We're continuing our series on this subconscious brain, and I hope you're finding it helpful. What I want to do today is just develop in a little more detail some of the research that's being done around the subconscious brain, and hopefully it will help you just understand even at a deeper level what we're talking about and to really appreciate the subtleties of this whole subject, but also give you some hope. And I want to cover kind of three different pieces today that will fill out this talk. So again, we're really focusing on the truth of what Carl Jung said years ago. Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. So the subconscious brain, which is made up of all kinds of programs, templates, default networks that are formed early in childhood, about what feels normal, that controls us. That affects our behavior, affects our thinking. That can get triggered in adult life. And it's when that programming has been faulty, maladaptive, when it gets triggered in adult life, it can do a ton of damage. It can do damage to self, to relationships, to those we love. And so it's really important to bring this whole subconscious area to the conscious level if we're going to begin to change it and get healthy and not have it control us. So the first thing I want to talk about today is a term you may have heard of. It might be new to you, and it's called the hedonic treadmill. And what it really refers to is the fact that what they're finding is we kind of have a default network when it comes to happiness. So there's this set point. So if you think of it this way, a person has this default set work of kind of their normal happiness level. And that came out of childhood. And then if you came out of complex trauma, that's usually not happiness. That default network is feeling a certain amount of discontent, anger, hurt. So that's their default network. But you have this kind of emotional happiness set point. So think of the fact of a person that gets a brand new house, a brand new job, and all of a sudden they feel all this pleasure and life is great, life is wonderful, but within a few months they're back to feeling the exact same way they've always felt. It's almost like this new house, this new job, new relationship, this wonderful, wonderful stuff that's been happening to them. It gave this little burst of pleasure, but then they settled back down to the same discontent, the same set point as they had before. So this is what is called the hedonic treadmill. And it's got a flip side to that. And it's basically you can have this set point of a certain amount of happiness, and then you can have a whole bunch of bad things happen to you. You can have a death, you can have hardship, and you go to this negative place for a while, but then you bounce back up to that set point again. So the challenge with this whole hedonic treadmill is complex trauma. Because complex trauma creates a set point that is basically negative. It's discontent, it's anger, it's guilt, it's shame, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's all kinds of different negative emotions, helplessness, hopelessness, constant stress. That's the normal. There's a discontent there, a dissatisfaction that is a constant, but it's the normal. And so what can happen if you don't become aware of that is you're constantly wanting better life, more money, better job, nicer house, a new relationship, and you get it and you feel better for a little while, but then you go back to that old place. That's the subconscious templates. That's what we're talking about. And so if you don't become aware of this whole issue, you will end up on this hedonic treadmill, and you won't understand why. You can get all this nice stuff, but within a few months you're back to feeling crappy again. So that's the hedonic treadmill. Let me take you to the second thing, and it's Dr. Vincent Felitti. So in 1998, there was an article in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine called The Relationship of Childhood Abuse and Household Dysfunction to Many of the Leading Causes of Death in Adults. the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. It was done by Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda and some colleagues. This all came out of 1985, where at the Kaiser Obesity Clinic in San Diego, and Dr. Vincent Felitti was interviewing his first patient of the day. So he was working in this obesity clinic, and his biggest medical breakthrough happened because of a verbal slip. So let me tell you what happened. And I've talked about Dr. Felitti and the ACE stuff before in another video, but I think it's, and you can watch that, but I think it's really important to kind of highlight again a really significant piece about this story, because it shows about templates, subconscious templates, and the power that they have. So Dr. Felitti was interviewing Donna, who was a 53-year-old woman with debilitating diabetes and a significant weight problem. In a new weight loss program, she had successfully lost upwards of 100 pounds 2 years before. But in the past 6 months, she put it all back on. Dr. Felitti, as you can imagine, was conflicted. He was frustrated, all this progress, and then it's undone in 6 months, put all the weight back on. But he's feeling responsible, that it's not her fault. He's got to figure out what's going on here. He's got to figure out why she's regressed so much. And he doesn't know. He's at a loss. She's been doing so well, and then right after all this hard work and progress, she just goes right back. So Dr. Felitti's determined to get to the bottom of this. And so he starts asking her a whole bunch of questions. So he goes, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh when you started first grade? How much did you weigh when you entered high school? How old were you when you first became sexually active? Now that was to be the question. But what came out was, instead of how old were you when you were first sexually active, it was how much did you weigh when you first became sexually active? And Donna says 40 pounds. Dr. Felitti is stopped. He just like, what? 40 pounds, like his brain is spinning. He's pretty sure maybe he heard her wrong. And so he didn't say anything for a minute, and then he said he's going to ask her the question again. So he said, sorry, Donna, how much did you weigh when you first became sexually active? And she went really quiet. And she waited. He waits for her to speak, sensing that something's here. And for those who've worked with patients, it's often that pregnant pause that leads to some really big breakthrough stuff. And so Donna finally speaks, and she says, I was 40 pounds. She said it was when I was 4 years old with my father. And you can imagine Dr. Felitti's stunned. But it gets him thinking. Is there a connection between that sexual abuse and all of this weight stuff that's been happening? So over the weeks afterwards, Dr. Felitti decides to go back to other patients, clients, who've done really well and then lost all the progress, have gone right back to the weights they've started. And so Patty, she started out as a model patient. In 51 weeks, she had gone from 408 pounds to 132 pounds. But then she lost it all. And then he started finding patient after patient after patient who was experiencing great results. Some lost up to 300 pounds in 1 year. But he began to realize that there was a dropout rate from many of these patients. If it had been patients who kind of dropped out early on because this was just too hard, he could understand that. But what it was the dropout rate was the highest among the most successful patients. The very ones who had stuck with it the longest, the ones who had seen the best results. They were the ones that all of a sudden were regressing and then dropping out of the program. And he's going, what in the world is going on here? They've reached their ideal weight. They're celebrating their hard-won goals, and then they disappear. They drop out of the program, or they come back months later having regained most of the weight that they lost. And so he decides to start talking to them. And so let's go to Patty. Patty, who had lost all of this weight, who had been doing so well, he could tell that she was on the verge of dropping out. All of a sudden, something shifted in her. Something wasn't the same in her. And in the last 3 weeks, she'd regained 37 pounds. So she's going the wrong way fast. And he wants to get her back on track before it's too late. So here's the dialogue that happened. Patty, what do you think is going on here? She goes, you mean the weight? Yes. Her smile dims. She looks down at her hands. And she says, I think I'm sleep eating. When she was a kid, she used to be a sleepwalker. And she hadn't done that for years. But when she would walk in her sleep, she would eat. And so what she's finding now is all of a sudden she goes to bed at night and the kitchen is clean, everything's put away. She gets up in the morning and there's pots and pans all over the place. There's dishes, cans are left empty and open on the counter. So she knows she's been sleepwalking and eating again, and that's where all this weight is coming from. So Dr. Felitti goes, okay, Patty, that explains the weight gain, but why are you sleepwalking now? You haven't done it for years. Patty goes, I don't know. So Dr. Felitti says, okay, think hard, Patty. What's been happening in your life? Why would you start sleep eating again? So Patty sits there quietly for a little while, and she says, I don't know if this is related, but there's this man at work. And she goes on to explain that in her job as a nurse at a convalescent home, she's in charge of a new patient who's been hitting on her. He's much older, he's married, and he's remarked on how good she looked and that she's lost all this weight, and he's propositioned her. So at first, Dr. Flea's not sure if he sees the connection. That's mild harassment kind of back in the 80s. Surely that wasn't significant enough to set off this sleepwalking and eating again. But as he began to probe further, things got more clear. Patty had a lengthy history of incest at the hands of her grandfather starting when she was 10 years old. And that, at 10 years old, was when she started to struggle with weight gain, eating too much. So what Dr. Felitti began to suspect is there a connection between weight gain, especially in women, and histories of abuse, sexual abuse? And so he began to talk to more patients and more patients. And to his shock, every patient he talked to acknowledged child abuse, sexual abuse. Just blew him away. So let me just say as an aside, what's the template that's being formed in that little child, that little girl's mind? It's all these men, family members, relatives that are sexually abusing me are telling me how pretty I am. So if I don't want to be sexually abused, because I don't like this attention, I need to not be pretty. And so they begin to eat, to gain weight, to make themselves less attractive. It's a protection against sexual abuse. It's their only way they know to set a boundary, to make people not interested in sexually abusing them, because nobody's listening to their no. They're not big enough to say no. They're not big enough to fight. But if they gain weight, that will protect them. So that's the main one. For some, what happens with the eating is all of a sudden when they're sexually abused, they've got all kinds of emotions happening that are very painful. They got guilt, they got fear, they got anger, they got hurt, they got confusion. And so in their family, when you're just feeling painful emotions, you eat to medicate those emotions. You eat your feelings. And so they start eating more because it makes them feel better and distracts them from having to feel all of those emotions. In some scenarios, they've been made to told that the reason that they are being sexually abused is their fault. They must have wanted it. And so they have this huge amount of guilt. And so part of the eating now is to punish themselves. So you got three possible pieces to forming the template in the mind of this child that are happening. And so what happened then with Patty, as soon as this man that she's now working with is paying attention to her and propositioning her, it is triggering that old subconscious template that says you can't say no to a man. You're helpless against a man. The only way that you can get men to not be interested in having sex with you is you have to gain weight again. And so all of a sudden, it's back to eating while she's sleepwalking. It set off a subconscious template that had been dormant for years. That is the power of this. Just out of interest, what happened after all of this with Dr. Felitti is he was introduced to a physician epidemiologist at Center for Disease Control called Robert Anda. And Anda had spent years at CDC researching the link between behavioral health and cardiovascular disease. And so for the next 2 years, Anda and Felitti reviewed all of the existing literature on the connection between abuse and obesity to try to figure out the best way to create a meaningful study into this whole topic, because they were convinced there was a connection. And so the aim was to identify 2 things, and this is what led to the ACE test, Adverse Childhood Experiences. First, the relationship between exposure to abuse or household dysfunction in childhood and adult risk behavior like alcoholism, smoking, obesity. So ways of coping that came out of childhood dysfunction and abuse. And the second thing was the relationship between exposure to abuse and dysfunction, childhood dysfunction, to diseases today. So the one is kind of destructive, self-destructive behaviors, and the other is actual physical diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular. So they looked in 10 different areas: recurring emotional abuse, recurring of physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect. So those are the 5 main types of things we talk about with complex trauma. And then substance abuse in the household, so living with a person who's a substance abuser, mental illness in the household. So these are the things that are going to result in the first 5 things. A mother who's being treated violently by the father, parents divorcing or separating, or one of the parents involved in criminal behavior or going to prison. So the last 5 are what lead to the first 5, but it's kind of the components of complex trauma. Now let me just say this. Many researchers today, many psychologists today are using ACE. This has become kind of the gold standard. But most are finding that it's a great starting point, but it's not adequate for all of the possible scenarios that we're dealing with today. What about refugees? What about people coming out of war-torn countries? What about people with racism? All of those different things. What about all of the different things that we discuss with complex trauma? And so we've developed a test that has over 60 questions, not just 10. But this is a great starting point to help people begin to understand adverse childhood experiences affects the immune system. It affects how we cope, maladaptive behaviors that set us up for huge problems later in life. It creates templates. And that's the part I want you to see today. It creates templates that are unhealthy, that can get triggered later in adult life and lead to major issues for a person. And unless those templates begin understood and brought to the conscious level, they will continue to run our life. It's also interesting that in doing all of the ACE studies, and Nadine Burke-Harris has been one of the big proponents within the San Francisco area and has set up clinics, and it is now kind of ACE tests are being used as just standard treatment stuff all across the state. What's important to realize is that they're realizing that over 2/3 of people have at least one ACE, one of those 10 things. And 12% have at least 4 or more of those things. So this is a lot more common than they thought it was. But then what they're realizing is that the higher your ACE score, the more potential to have health problems, maladaptive behavior problems like addiction, eating disorders, all of those things. And so this is such a huge thing in helping people begin to understand their health risks and some of their issues in society. What is really sad to me is Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was able to talk to Dr. Felitti years after he did this initial research. And Dr. Harris asked why she hadn't heard of this stuff. And Dr. Felitti said, well, it almost petered out. Said he got so much flack from the medical professionals when he first came out with this research, criticizing it, saying it was not based on evidence, saying it was not accurate, that it almost petered out, almost lost traction. And what they really began to realize is there was a fear amongst medical professionals to look at health issues any other way than they'd always looked at them. They wanted to say, oh, if you've got health issues, a disease, it's because of your genetics, it's because of a germ, instead of saying it's because of toxic stress in childhood. That totally would upset the apple cart. And so instead of being open to say, maybe we've got it wrong, maybe we need to rethink things, maybe you're onto something, they criticized it, and it almost lost traction totally. But thankfully it started to come back, and now it is gaining traction, but there's still a lot of opposition to it. Now I want to take this just a little bit farther. So these women had a subconscious template that made it feel right to do things that were harmful to them. What I want you to think about is that one of the sad results of complex trauma is that most people with more severe complex trauma have many templates that they're not even aware of, that they do the opposite of what is healthy. Those templates, once they're triggered, pull them to do what is harmful for them, the opposite of what is healthy for them. So let me just give you 4 examples of kind of the common ones with that. So let's begin with fear. So a healthy response when a child is in fear is oxytocin is released in the brain, which makes them run to mom or dad for comfort, for support, and then their fear calms down, so they run authentically towards mom and dad to their supports. That's the solution. But what would happen in a complex trauma family where a child runs to their parents in fear, and their parents punish them, their parents shame them, their parents ignore them? Well, that healthy response results in more pain. That healthy response doesn't resolve the problem. So what does the child then do? They isolate. They pull away from people whenever they feel fear. So a template gets formed so that whenever you feel fear, instead of doing what is healthy and running to safe, loving people, you pull away from people and isolate, the exact opposite of what is healthy. You do what ends up being harmful to you. Take the second one, guilt. So guilt is this emotion when I do something that violates love, and it's combined with empathy. So when I do something that's against love, I hurt somebody else. And empathy is what enables me to see that my behavior has hurt them. I see them crying. I see them upset. And that empathy creates this guilt, which then motivates me to move towards the person, to try to resolve it, to change my behavior, to humble myself. That's the healthy response of guilt. But what happens if a child grows up in complex trauma and they have done something that violates love? They move towards their parents to apologize, to try to resolve it, and their parents punish them. Their parents give them a long rant and don't forgive them. Their parents shame them. Again, the healthy response didn't resolve, didn't restore the relationship, didn't restore the connection. The healthy response resulted in more pain. And so now they create a template that as soon as you feel guilt, don't move towards the person, don't humble yourself, rather move away from people, hide, harden your heart, don't humble yourself. The exact opposite of what is healthy. And they can be doing that through their whole adult life and not even be aware that as soon as guilt is triggered, they get pulled in a direction that actually hurts them, that doesn't resolve it in a healthy way. It gives them temporary feelings that it's resolved because they feel a little better, but it only makes things worse in the long run. Let me give a third example. Conflict. So, healthy home, there's conflict, there's tension. And so what happens? The child moves towards the person that they're in conflict with authenticity. They explain themselves, but yet they are humble. They want to understand where the other person's coming from so that they can work out, understand each other, figure out the best solution, resolve it, and the connection is restored. But again, what happens for a child in complex trauma? There's conflict between them and their mom or dad. They move towards the parents, but the parents aren't concerned about resolving the situation. The parents only concerned about winning, about the being right, that everybody else has to be wrong. They cannot lose this. So they are willing to twist things, to play dirty, to be hurtful, all kinds of tactics to win, to conquer. They have to win. That creates a template in the child that conflict can't be resolved. Conflict only leads to more pain if you try to resolve it. And so now in adult life, whenever there's conflict, what do? Avoid, keep the peace no matter what. Don't talk about it, just give in. You move away from what is healthy, and it seems to help things, but it never resolves anything, so it's ultimately making things worse. Or they go to, I'm going to fight even dirtier than my parents did. I'm going to win at any cost. And so they go fight, flight. That becomes their template. But what I want you to see again is that template now is pulling them, whenever there's conflict, is pulling them in the direction opposite of what is healthy. A final one, shame. So a child is feeling embarrassed, a child is feeling insecure, kids at school have laughed at them, made fun of their looks, they made a mistake in class and the teacher pointed it out, so they come home and they're feeling all of this insecurity, shame stuff. What do in a healthy home? They move with full authenticity to their parents. They say, this is what has happened, this is how I'm feeling. How do the parents respond? The parents love them unconditionally. They say you're totally accepted. The child is validated. The child is reassured. The child is comforted. The child is given love to know that they're okay the way they are, that a mistake doesn't mean they're a failure. All of that takes place. And the child realizes that, okay, I do have value. But what happens for a child that grows up in complex trauma? They come home feeling insecure, they make a little mistake, and the parent responds by saying, you are a mistake. You're an embarrassment. The parents shame them even more. The parents don't accept them. The parents do things that make the child feel rejected, that they're not good enough. They just heap on the shame feelings. And so what is the template that's being born? That whenever you feel shame, if you talk about it authentically with people, it's only going to lead to more shame. It's only going to lead to more pain. So whenever you feel shame, don't move towards people authentically. Move away from people. Hide. Isolate. Do the opposite of what is healthy. Now you can give some more thought to kind of other templates like this, but it's so important to begin to realize that coming out of complex trauma are probably many, many templates that soon as they're triggered, they actually pull you to do the opposite of what is healthy, what is harmful to you. Let me take you to the third thing. And this to me is to give you hope. And it's really that, can we heal these subconscious templates that have been misprogrammed, that are maladaptive programmed? Yes, we can. And so this comes out of some landmark research done by Dr. Michael Meany and his colleagues at McGill University. So Meany and his team were looking at two groups of rat mothers and their pups. So rat mothers, rat pups. And they noticed that when the pups were handled by the researchers, they would then put them back to the mothers. And some of the mothers would immediately start licking the pups from head to toe. And what they were realizing is that the mother sensed that when the pup was in the hands of the researcher, that the pup was tense. The pup was being stressed by being in a stranger's hands, in an unfamiliar setting, away from its mother. And so when the mother was licking it, it was to help it calm down. It was kind of equivalent to kissing and hugging a small child who's stressed out. It's helping to regulate them. It's helping their stress system to relax. And so that was fascinating research, is to realize that this was an important part of the mother helping the child regulate its emotions. But then what they began to realize is that not all mothers, rat mothers, lick their pups to the same extent. Some mothers lick their pups over the top, tons and tons. Others hardly lick them at all. And so they began to check out the stress systems within the pups that were getting tons and tons of licking and those that were getting little bits of licking. And what they did observe was that the pup's response to stress was highly dependent on how much their mother licked them. If they didn't get licked very much, the pup was becoming more stressed. Their stress wasn't getting resolved as well. They weren't getting back to a baseline that was healthy as well, whereas the ones that were getting lots of licking, they were much more regulated in a much better place. But then they began to find that the pups of the high licker mums were developing, not just mom was helping them regulate their emotions, but they were developing a more sensitive and effective stress thermostat. So they were able to better tell when they're in a situation if this was too stressful for them or not stressful enough, whether they would be able to tolerate the stress, whether they had the tools to handle the stress. And so they had kind of an accurate reading of whether, you know what, this is uncomfortable, but I can manage it. I don't need to go to fight or flight. They had that. Whereas the low liquor pups, they didn't have as good a thermostat. And so they had a much harder time not getting overstimulated, overstressed, when it was really something that they could have tolerated. And then once their stress got activated, they had a harder time shutting it back down, getting them back to a regular place. So their stress thermostat just wasn't as attuned, and they weren't able to regulate their emotions and get them settled back down. But then they did another thing. What they began to realize was that the licking and grooming behavior that occurred in the first 10 days of the pup's lives had a great effect on predicting how they'd respond to stress for the rest of their life. It set the template. It set the thermostat. It set all the systems in motion for the rest of their life, that first 10 days. But then they went even further. That then affected how those pups parented their pups. It affected the next generation. So the pups from mums who licked them a lot, licked their kids a lot. The pups from mums who didn't lick them very much, didn't lick their kids very much. And so it got passed on to the next generation how they handled stress and their stress thermostat. But then they took it even further, and this is where it starts to get quite exciting. they took some of the pups who didn't have a mom who licked them very much, whose thermostat wasn't working, who weren't able to regulate their stress very well, and they put them into a family with a mom who licked a lot. And the mom adopted them and started to lick that pup very, very much. And what they found was it changed the genetic operation of that pup. And so they became more influenced by their adopted mom than by their birth mom in learning to manage stress. So that the adopted mom and her licking of the pup and helping the pup work through stuff began epigenetically to affect the development of that pup and how it responded to stress. And so what I want you to understand from that, and this is the part that to me gives me so much hope, is those pups who didn't have lots of licking. You could say, well, that was kind of neglect. That was kind of complex trauma. They weren't getting the connection they needed. They weren't getting the co-regulating they needed from their caregiver. But once they got a surrogate mother who met those needs, did what they needed to have done for them, they learned to regulate. It helped them grow. It changed their template. It was so important. And that's what we're finding with complex trauma in adults. That a child with complex trauma, yes, it messes up a lot of systems. It messes up the whole stress system in the body. It messes up the immune system. But when they're able to get a surrogate family, when they're able to get people in their life who care for them, who help them meet their needs, who are co-regulators, who are nurture them, who are safe harbors for them, all those templates can begin to change. All those systems can begin to heal, and they can begin to grow, and they can begin to develop in healthy ways. And so, for many people, all of this teaching that I've been giving about templates has been quite difficult and quite heavy. And at times it can feel overwhelming, like this template is there, it's unconscious. It's just so negative and it's so powerful. I don't know if I can ever change it. I hope this research helps you begin to realize when we get connection in new surrogate families where our needs begin to get met and we begin to get cared for, we can heal, we can grow, we can rewrite templates, we can get healthy templates, and positive change begins to happen. So, from Dr. Felitti, and realizing that, wow, early childhood stuff can set templates that when they're triggered later in life can set off some really unhealthy behaviors that totally defeat what the person is trying to accomplish in their conscious brain. And the power of those early templates and how you're not even aware of what's going on, and the connection to adult behavior, and then to the Dr. Meany and these rat pups and rat mums. I hope that encourages you. Well, that's the end of another Friday. And I just wanted this to be very practical and just very